It's a joy to be here with you. Consider you a friend and Grace Point and just the whole team, friends, and have loved to partner in ministry. And I appreciate this opportunity because we're going to jump in and look at one of the toughest issues that really can be looked at today, which is if God, why evil? And I just opened up my news app just while we were waiting here, and you just read down the news, and there's stories about racial injustice, about our president getting COVID. There's stories about somebody else getting COVID. There's issues about somebody who was sexting. All the stories are full and clearly portray the brokenness that's in the world. So if God is so loving and powerful, why is this world so broken? Now we're going to jump in, but if you expect that when you're done with this, you have some hurt or pain in your life, and I'm going to tell you exactly why God allowed this, I'm going to tell you right now, you're going to be disappointed. I don't always know why God allows certain acts of evil or suffering. The bigger question is, which worldview makes the most sense, I think, intellectually and emotionally with the brokenness that's in the world? That's the question. And I'm a Christian because when it's all said and done, I think Christianity makes the most sense of it. Now I'm going to share my screen here just so we can track through with some of these slides I think will be helpful. But let's jump in and kind of make some progress working through this question together. When you look at certain people like Einstein, interestingly enough, he made statements like God doesn't play dice with the universe, but he couldn't believe in a personal God because of evil and suffering. You look at people like Charles Darwin. It actually wasn't Darwin's science that led him away from faith. It was one of the reasons was the premature death of his daughter. And even Bart Ehrman, probably the most influential living atheist today, has said distinctly, he said, quote, I left the faith. He went to Moody Bible College, Wheaton Bible College, for what I took to be and still take to be an unrelated reason, the problem of suffering in the world. Now, this is not just a question that non-Christians ask. This is a question that Christians wrestle with too. Habakkuk 1:2, the prophet cries out, he says, how long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen, or cry out to you violence, and you do not save? This to me is the biggest question that people are asking about God. Now, when we talk about the problem of evil, though, it's important that we place this because this isn't just a problem we solve, like we say, solve a geometry problem. This is a personal issue. All of us have experienced evil. We've all contributed to the evil in the world. I remember when my wife was pregnant with our third, and the doctor came in and basically told us that we had a miscarriage. And my wife and I sat there and we cried. Now, we didn't blame God, but we felt that pain personally. Many of you have been through a lot of hurt and pain and naturally wondered, where is God? So keep in mind as we talk about this, it's an intellectual, but also what you might call an emotional issue. Now, I graduated from Biola in 1998, probably before a decent number of you were born. And my senior year, I took a class called Apologetics with one of the leading philosophers in the world, who's a colleague of mine now at Biola. His name is J.P. Moreland. And I got an A in apologetics class. And I remember thinking, gosh, I killed it in this class. I'm looking for people to have conversations with. So I was working for my dad for a year, and we were in Breckenridge, Colorado, up in the mountains. And I sat down to get my haircut. And this lady noticed I was holding a Christian book. And so she says to me, she was probably 25 or 30 as I sat down. She says, hey, is that a Christian book? I said, yes. She said, you mind if I ask you some questions? I immediately jumped in. I said, no, but inside I'm thinking, of course not. I just got an A in apologetics. Bring it on. So the first question as I sit down, she's starting to cut my hair, is something like, if there's such a good and all-powerful God, why is there so much evil in the world? And we had just spent like a few days studying this. So inside I'm thinking, that's all you got? This is easy. I got an A. So I start launching into my response. And she had a question, I had an answer. She had a question, I had an answer. All of a sudden, getting my hair cut, she steps back and she starts to cry. And she's like, her hands are shaking. She goes, it can't be this easy. You have an answer for everything. I remember sitting there like, gosh, what's up with Miss Sensitive? We're having a great conversation. And all of a sudden she cries. Inside, I didn't say that. Changed the subject. I felt bad, gave her a big tip, and I walked out. a friend of mine was with me and I was like, man, what is up with her? We're having a great like debate. And all of a sudden she starts crying. And I'll never forget what he said. He goes, Sean, do you have any idea how arrogant you just were towards her? And it hit me like a ton of bricks that I was more interested in sounding smart and winning an argument than truly helping somebody who in front of me was probably hurting. You see, whenever somebody asks me a question now, why does God allow evil? One of the questions I'll often ask back is this: of all the questions you can ask about God, why that one? And then what you hear will tell you whether this is an emotional question or whether it's an intellectual question. If somebody says, you know what, my parents got divorced, or my uncle died of cancer, or I was bullied as a kid, you know this is a personal, heartfelt question. If somebody says, hey, I was in a chat room and we're having this debate, you know it's probably intellectual. And how we respond to the emotional problem is different than how we respond to the intellectual problem. You see, Romans 12:15, one of my favorite verses in the Bible, says, rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. In other words, when somebody's happy, be happy with them, share their joy. But when somebody is hurting, hurt with them. The human Christian response when somebody is suffering is not to say, hey, Romans 8:28, God says to work everything for the good. Turn that frown upside down. Like, no. Sometimes the best response is just to listen and be present. Some of our dear family friends lost their son at 15 years old to cancer. I mean, it was devastating. And I'll never forget something this young man said. He said, the greatest present you can give someone is your presence. And he's right. When people are hurting, just being present with them is the right response for a Christian to start with. So keep that in mind as we talk about we're going to shift to the philosophical question. As Christians, if we would listen and we would love and we just be present with people and not feel like we have to solve it, that would take us a long ways. Now, with that said, let's shift to what we mean the philosophical problem. And what I found is when we as Christians understand why God allows evil, it gives us one tool to deal with some of the emotional hurt that comes along with experiencing suffering and experiencing evil. So let's start with this. What is the philosophical problem? My dad often said to me growing up, he said, son, a problem well defined is half solved. So what do we mean by the problem of evil? Let's start with what we mean by evil. What is evil? Well, C.S. Lewis famously said, and by the way, he was formerly an atheist before he became a Christian. In Mere Christianity, he said, my argument against God as an atheist was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust. But how had I gotten this idea of just and unjust, right? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? In other words, he said, as an atheist, he looked at the world and he couldn't believe in God because of injustice. But then he had a deeper thought. He said, wait a minute. If you have injustice, there must be justice. And if there's really objective justice, there must be a God. You see, if you look at the world and say it's evil, you're saying the world shouldn't be this way. But that assumes there's a way the world should be. But if there's no God, how is there any way the world should be? You see, when we define evil, I think we realize that you can have good without evil, but you cannot have evil without good. Let me say it again. You can have good without evil, but you can't have evil without good. You see, we tend to think of good and evil like Taoism, these equal and opposite forces kind of competing with each other. I think if we reflect upon it, this is not a helpful or accurate view of evil. Think about it more like something that has a design and goes bad, gets corrupted. So here's an image of an original design of a wrench. It's good, it's proper, that's the way it's supposed to be. Well, what happens when it goes bad? It gets rusted. Evil is like some original design that gets rusted, that gets broken. I'll give you another example. Take healthy teeth, and some of you know where this is going. Let me save you the pain. do not Google tooth decay. Let me tell you right now, don't Google tooth decay. But a kind of image is actually a mild one, to be honest with you. What happens? You can have healthy teeth that never go bad if you floss and brush your teeth and don't eat a lot of sugar. But you can only have unhealthy teeth if you first have teeth that get corrupted or broken and decay. You see, that's what we mean by evil. In fact, here's a simple definition. Evil is a corruption of what is good. Evil is a corruption of what is good. So let me give you one more example to make sure this sinks in. Think about truth and lies. What's more basic? Well, you can have truth without somebody telling a lie, but you can only tell a lie if there's first a standard of truth. A lie is a corruption of truth. So when the atheist says, look at the evil in the world, how can there be a God? Ironically, they're looking at the world saying the world shouldn't be that way. The world is broken. But that only makes sense if there is a way the world should be, and if there is a design that's been broken or corrupted. Now, this doesn't tell us why God allows evil, but ironically, the claim that evil in the world is a problem for God actually points towards there being an objectively good standard. You can only have an objectively good standard if there's actually a God. Now let's shift and ask, okay, so evil points towards good, and good only makes sense if there's a God. Let's talk about what's called the logical problem of evil and see how Christians could maybe respond to this. This is Sam Harris, one of the leading atheists of our day, and he writes this. He states the problem of evil well. He said, if God exists, either he can do nothing to stop the most egregious calamities, or he does not care to. God, therefore, is either impotent or evil. There's another possibility, of course, and is both the most reasonable and least odious. The biblical God is a fiction like Zeus and the thousands of other dead gods who most sane beings now ignore. You see essentially what Sam Harris is raising. This is called the problem of evil. And if you put it in premise form, it would look like this. If God is all powerful, he can stop evil. If God is all good, he would want to stop evil. Yet evil exists. So therefore, an all good, all powerful God cannot exist. Now, we look at this as Christians and we go, I believe God exists. How do I get out of this dilemma? Well, one way would be to deny that evil actually exists, that evil things really take place. That's an option. In fact, that's the option many Eastern religions take, is they say that evil is just an illusion. I don't know about you, but when I look at things like sex abuse and genocide and racism, if you have a worldview that doesn't say those things are evil, it seems to me you need to get another worldview. That doesn't seem like a valid option. So let's start with the first one. If God is all good, he can stop evil. Now, of course, God can stop evil, and he will stop evil someday. Someday, all of us are going to stand before God and face judgment. All of us will. But the key to wrestling with this premise is what we mean by God being all powerful. Now, typically when I speak to audiences, I'll say, how many think God is all powerful? If it's a Christian group, all the hands will go up. I'll say, how many think God can do anything? And hands will go up. And I'll say, okay, can God make a rock so big that he can't move it? Or as Bart Simpson would say, could God make a burrito so big he can't eat it? If you say, yes, he can do it, then he's limited. If you say, no, he can't do it, then he's limited. Either way, God's not all powerful. So the challenge goes. Well, how do we get out of this? Do we actually mean that God can do anything? Well, oftentimes when I'm speaking, what I'll do is I'll ask for a volunteer from the audience, maybe a young person will run up, and I'll say, okay, I'll give you a free scholarship to Biola University if you can bend this paperclip into a square circle. Now, usually at this point, people stop and don't even try. Occasionally, a freshman will try, but normally people don't try. So I'll have them sit down. Then I'll say, okay, I need the strongest person in the room. At this point, we'll often say a football player or a wrestler, a weightlifter will run up. I'll say, okay, you're stronger. Can you bend this into a square circle? And the answer is no, right? It doesn't matter how much power you add. This cannot be bent into a square circle. It's not possible. Because if something has more or less points than 4, it's not a square. If it has no points, or some would say infinite points in a circle, it's not a square. You can't have a square circle. You ready? Even God can't make a square circle. That's not a limitation on God. That's when we say God is all powerful, we mean God can do anything that power can do. And a square circle can't exist, so God couldn't make it. By the way, the Bible says there's quite a few things that God actually can't do. It says in the book of Hebrews that God can't lie. It says in the book of James that God can't be tempted. So I had a high school student one time, he said, wait a minute, I can tell lie. God can't tell lie. Am I more powerful than God? I said, you have it totally backwards. I said, no, you can tell a lie because you're capable of being tempted and you're not perfect. God can't and won't tell a lie because he is perfect. That's a strength on his part, a weakness on ours. So how does this apply to our first premise? Well, look, God can make a world in which there's no evil. But just like God can't make a square circle, God also can't make a world in which there's free beings who always choose what is right. Because if he makes them always choose what is right, they're not free. And if they're free, he's not making them choose what is right. Alvin Plantinga is one of the most influential philosophers in the world today. He said a world containing creatures who are significantly free is more valuable, all else being equal, than a world containing no free creatures at all. Now, God can create free creatures, but he can't cause or determine them to only do what is right. For if he does so, then they aren't significantly free, after all, to create creatures capable of moral good. Therefore, he must create creatures capable of moral evil. And he can't give those creatures the freedom to perform evil and at the same time prevent them from doing so. He's absolutely right. God can't make a square circle. He also can't make beings truly free and force them to always do what is right. So if God is going to create a world which we can choose to be in a relationship with him and other people, he has to give us the capacity to choose not to enter into that relationship. Now let's look at the second premise. If God is all good, he would want to stop evil. So this one is calling God's good character into question, not his power. Well, C.S. Lewis, once again, said something I think is brilliant in his book, The Problem of Pain. He said, God whispers in our pleasure, but shouts in our pain. Pain is God's megaphone to a deaf world. Now, what was his point? C.S. Lewis was saying, it's not that God causes evil, but God allows evil and suffering, because that's often what it takes to wake us up to think about eternal things. In other words, normally in life, we go on, we get busy, we get distracted. But when something goes wrong, it's like we have one of two choices. Either we choose to follow God or choose not to follow God. God allows pain and suffering because his primary concern is not that you have 2.2 kids and you make a lot of money and have a house with a white picket fence. God is more concerned with our eternal destinies and with our character. And he knows that allowing evil is what wakes many people up to consider trusting him. So take the story of Francis Collins, for instance. Francis Collins is one of the most influential scientists in the world. He helped map the human genome in the 1990s under President Clinton. Today, he's the head of the NIH, National Institute for Health, for President Trump. Well, Francis Collins was also an atheist when he was in medical school. And when he was in hospice is when you would care for people who essentially are dying. And as an atheist, he started to notice that Christians had a certain peace about their life that other people didn't have. As an atheist, that shook him up. And one lady asked him in particular, she said, as an atheist, how do you face death? And he had never really thought about it before. To make a long story short, it shook him up. He went and read C.S. Lewis's book, Mere Christianity. and ended up becoming a Christian. Now, here's what's so fascinating about this story is so many of the people who influence him probably will never know until they get to heaven that their lives and the way they lived through suffering would actually help draw one of the great scientists of our day to the faith. They could never know that. I mean, you go back to the beginning of the church, it was actually how Christians suffered with kindness, with sacrificial love that attracted many people to the Christian faith. There was something different about their lives that invited people to consider how they could have a peace amidst the chaos. So maybe because God is good, he will allow there to be some suffering because that's going to draw us ultimately to the kingdom. Now, I want to show you a video. If you're a baseball player, you might recognize this baseball player. He played a number of years ago, but I did this apologetics curriculum and had a chance to interview him. And we asked him the question, why did God allow you to suffer? Because he suffered in a way he's going to describe. I want you to hear his response.
I had the wonderful experience of seeing a boyhood dream become a reality. I wanted to be a major league pitcher, and I found myself pitching for the San Diego Padres. I'll never forget June 8th of 1982 when I got called up from the minor leagues, and I was now in the big leagues and living this dream. For the next 5 years, I was in the San Diego Padres organization, and then got traded over to San Francisco, and in many respects, a new lease on life with the Giants. And I'll never forget opening day, 1988, pitching against the Dodgers. We win 5-1, and I'm on my way to what I thought was going to be a 20-win season. And all of a sudden, a small lump develops in my left arm. Being a left-handed pitcher, not a good thing. And by September of that year, the doctors were telling me that that lump was cancer. And so my world came crumbling down. And the doctors looked at me and said, outside of a miracle, you'll never pitch again. Well, for the next 10 months, I went through rehab, and I had to try because I didn't want to live with that question looming over my head. If I never tried, then could I have come back to play again? So off I embarked on this journey to come back. And August 10th, 1989, I'm standing on the mound again in Candlestick Park for the San Francisco Giants, getting ready to pitch against the Cincinnati Reds. And it's the miracle of the comeback. We win that game 4-3. I'm back in the saddle. Everything's going great. 5 days later, we're in Montreal pitching against the Expos. It's the 6th inning. I rear back and I throw a fastball to Tim Raines. My left arm snaps in half. From there, obviously the cancer reoccurs. I retire from baseball, and I go through the next battle in this journey through pain and suffering. And the cancer, along with radiation treatments, a staph infection, all of that culminating with June 18th, 1991, having the left arm and shoulder amputated to save my life. And in the midst of that, there were a number of questions that were looming around this issue of pain and suffering. And I'll never forget going on Barbara Walters and on 2020, and she had actually point blank asked me, why did God make you suffer? That's an amazing question. Amazing question. And to be honest with you, I didn't know how to answer it at the time. Why did God make me suffer? Did God make me suffer? But in the end, this whole idea of suffering is so much bigger than what I think we can discover here on this earth. So much bigger. And we really can't see everything that God's doing, but I do know one thing: I can trust God in the midst of it. And the bottom line is that through this journey, there was always hope because of what Christ did for me on the cross. There was always hope. Now, in the midst of the pain and the suffering, there were days that were so hard. I experienced clinical depression. I had fear, I had doubt, I had worry. And at the end of all of that, there were choices that I had to make. And there were two choices in particular. I could either look at this experience and walk away from God, or I could move directly towards the heart of God and trusting Him to provide the strength I would need to get to the other side of this. And that's what I chose. I chose the path of hope. I chose the path of encouragement and comfort and strength that comes through knowing God through His Son, Jesus Christ. And with that hope, I'm here today, and I can say that cancer's been a blessing in my life.
Those are pretty powerful words. You don't hear people say too often, that cancer has been a blessing. let me take a step back and consider what we've looked at here. The charge is, if God is all powerful and all good, evil would not exist. But even God can't create a world in which there are truly free beings who can love him and love others and force them to do good. Second is, if God was all good, he'd want to stop evil. Well, yes, God is all good, but maybe he allows evil for a purpose to conform our character and draw us to him. And we see that taking place sometime. So most scholars will admit that this argument does not prove that the Christian story is false. So far, we've played defense, but let's ask a question, then we'll take some questions from you. What is the unique Christian response to suffering and evil? And for this, let me take you to a story by somebody by the name of Father Damien. This is a priest in the late 1800s who heard about this colony of lepers on Molokai who were living and dying without a priest. So of his own free will, he chose to become a priest for this colony of lepers. He preached to them. He built caskets for them. He counseled them. He cared for them. And 12 years into his time, he stood in front of them and he said two words that changed everything. He said, "We lepers," as he opened up his robe and he showed the first signs of leprosy. Now, before he got leprosy, did they know that he loved them? Of course. But what changed on that day? What changed on that day is he wasn't, so to speak, from the outside caring for them. He became one of them and understood intimately what they were going through. Let me ask you a question. Is Jesus more like Father Damien before he got leprosy or after? And the answer is after. It is only in the Christian story. It says God didn't just send a book. He didn't just send a prophet, didn't just send an angel. God sent his own son to step into our suffering and to experience it with us. That's why when somebody says, "Where's God when I suffer?" part of the answer is God is right there suffering with you. Friends, it's only in Christianity where we can say God understands and he enters into the suffering with us. He gets it. That's why Hebrews 4:15 talks about we have a high priest who understands and in all ways has been tempted and yet without sin. So if you've ever felt betrayed by a friend, you can't say to Jesus, "Oh, you don't understand." He's like, "Yeah, I got betrayed by one of the 12. If your family has rejected you, you can't say to Jesus, "Honestly, you don't get it. It hurts so much. They reject me." Jesus is like, "My brothers tried to trick me," as recorded in John 7, to go into Judea and potentially get killed. If you're physically hurting, you can't say, "Jesus, I don't understand." He's like, "Yeah, I was crucified. Pretty sure I get it." Part of the power of the Christian story is that God is present and he empathizes with us. But of course, that's not the end of the story. The end of the story is when it's all said and done, the reason I think God is good is because of the resurrection, because Jesus conquered the grave and it's the first fruits of what will happen to all of us. The first fruits. So imagine you're those disciples when Jesus gets arrested. Even though he had told them he'd be arrested and come back, they just didn't get it for whatever reason. They think he's the one. They think he's going to usher in his kingdom. And then he's arrested. And he's not only killed, he is utterly humiliated and shamed through crucifixion. Your dreams and this movement you were thought you were part of was done. So in Luke 24, these apostles say, "We thought he was the one, but he's not." Ironically, when they thought God had let go of the steering wheel and they thought all was lost, God was working his greatest good. He was actually redeeming the world, and Jesus comes back on the third day. Now, because we have a reason to believe that story is true, that gives us confidence when we're in the midst of evil and suffering, and we don't know why it's happening. We don't know why. That's where faith comes in. A friend of mine, Doug Groteis, is a professor, PhD in philosophy, brilliant. His wife was even smarter in the sense she was a part of the International High IQ Society. And she got dementia and over years could not even remember how to tie her shoes. And he wrote a book about this, how painful it was to see this happening. And he said the biggest question, the barrier that determined how he dealt with suffering was basically this. Was I going to think that I knew better than God? Or was I going to trust God through this? That's the question. And that's why, because there is life after death, and Jesus has conquered the grave, that Paul, the great apostle of suffering, who was shipwrecked and beaten and robbed and stoned, in 1 Corinthians 15, when it talks about the resurrection, he can actually say, "Oh, death, where is your victory? Oh, death, where is your sting?" Death has been conquered. The grave has been conquered. Evil has ultimately been conquered, but we're in the middle of it. And we don't always know how God is going to use it. We don't know why he allows it. We know God exists. We know God is good. And the question is, will we trust him in the present?